Thanks for taking a few moments for a discussion on synchronicity, serendipity, and what I call sequencity. So let's jump in. A lot of people have a basic understanding of synchronicity. I found it to be very invaluable as I went through the breakdown, what can be called a stress breakdown, awakening, spiritual emergency, all sorts of different things that I plan on covering in other segments. So synchronicity was introduced by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, give the dates that he lived. He published a book in 1960 towards the end of his life called Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. As I looked up definitions for synchronicity, there's actually multiple ones floating around, and I even learned that he had a few different definitions that he came up with depending on the context. I provide a few here. A meaningful coincidence of two or more events where something other than probability of chance is involved. He uses, again, the coincidence in time of two causally unrelated events that have the same or similar meaning. And it is an acausal principle, meaning independent, not related, and can be defined by a meaningful coincidence which appears between a mental state and an event occurring in the external world. So there's an internal event that matches and it coincides with something that happens in what would be the external world. So as I mentioned, there's multiple definitions. I choose to work off the one that coincidence in time of two causally unrelated events that have the same or similar meaning. I don't tend to use the word coincidence, even though my name is Penny and coin begins that word. I should be, prone to use it, but I prefer simultaneous occurrence of two or more independent, unrelated events that have the same or similar meaning. The main thing about these definitions is this concept of meaning. So it's not just a coincidence, it's a meaningful coincidence. And in looking at the definition, I consider there to be four key elements: that there's two or more events, that they happen at the same time or coincide and are simultaneous, that they are actually unrelated and independent of each other, so one does not cause the other, and that they share a same or similar meaning. And often that meaning is somewhat significant, somewhat deep to the person noticing this connection. One of the famous examples that Carl Jung is associated with is he was seeing a client. I'm not sure what years it was. Things had kind of stalled out where this client wasn't very receptive to a therapeutic process. And the night before a session, she had a dream. And in their session, she was describing this golden scarab. And I went out and found an image of what this bug, this beetle, looks like. And right as they were talking about it, Carl Jung heard something scratching or something making a noise at the window. And he went over and took a look, and here was something called a rose chafer beetle trying to, get in through the window. And this is the picture below. So in Switzerland, the golden scarab does not exist. And so this is basically the closest type beetle that would match a golden scarab. And the woman, the client, Jung showed the beetle to the client. They had just been discussing this. And the woman was so surprised or so moved or impressed or responded in such a way that it actually helped them move forward in their sessions. Now, Joseph Campbell also has an example that is described by Stanislav Grof in his book, The Impossible, which talks about non-ordinary states of consciousness. And as Stan Grof describes it, the Campbells, Joseph and his wife Jean, were living in Greenwich Village in New York. They had a 14th-story apartment. He was working on one of his books involving the animal powers, and he was writing about African Bushmen, and specifically about a deity, Mantis, as it was called, which was this combination of a creation god and some kind of trickster. And he was surrounded around with all these books, these articles. He was reading about a specific woman named Clara who seemed to have a relationship and felt she could communicate with a praying mantis. And while he was doing his work, for whatever reason, Joseph Campbell felt an urge, compelled to go over and open a window. And as Groff describes it in his book, that window had kind of a boring view compared to the other windows in the apartment. And that window tended to stay closed. It just, I guess that's what Campbell had told him. And so as Campbell opened this window, he looked to the right and saw this large praying mantis climbing up the wall. Now, keep in mind, this is 14 stories up. I certainly wouldn't expect to see a praying mantis at that height, and neither did Joseph Campbell. And the way it's described in the book is that this praying mantis turned his head towards Joseph Campbell, and Campbell described it as a meaningful look. That's the phrase used in the book. And it apparently had quite the impact on Joseph. I mentioned that, according to Groff, it left a powerful impression. He recognized something that he witnessed as having a human quality. And he described the heart-shaped pointed chin, which that's why I went out and grabbed a picture of one. I did not know what the face of a praying mantis looked like. And just looking at this sequence of highly improbable events, that one, you'd see a praying mantis on the 14th floor of a building in Manhattan or in New York City. The fact that he had the desire to open a window that normally was closed, that normally he would go open some other window, and that he came across this connection while he was reading and studying about this deity figure, this mantis. So that's another example of synchronicity. And I kind of get a chuckle that they both involve bugs. So I don't know if there's something about scarabs and praying mantis. Actually, I found it kind of funny. I'm recording this on a Friday. Just a few days ago, I was walking my former neighbor's dog, and we were walking, and I walked under a tree, and I noticed something kind of fall out of the tree. It was like a little round something. It wasn't like a stone, but maybe a dead leaf or something. And I looked down, and there on the edge of the pocket of my shirt was a little ladybug. Now, I wouldn't call that synchronous because I wasn't thinking of a ladybug. Ladybugs don't have a specific meaning to me, but just in terms of a highly improbable event. And that's something I would maybe call more serendipitous than synchronous or synchronistic. Serendipity is often described as a fortunate accident, a happy accident, something unplanned that you stumble upon that generally is favorable. I looked up where it came from. I had not done that before, even though I notice serendipity all the time in my life, along with synchronicity. It was coined in 1754 by Horace Walpole in a letter to Thomas Mann. It's based on a Persian fairy tale, The Three Princes of Serendip, which, as I understand it, which was described was Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. In the letter, he describes that these three princes or heroes were always making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things they were not in quest of. So in other words, you're not seeking it, you come across it, but you have these discoveries. And how I didn't think of it in terms of relating to synchronicity is that the person involved is kind of synchronous with that event, with finding it, coming across something of benefit. The person, the event is independent from the person involved. That is, it's an accident. And it also has meaning, or is at least noteworthy in terms of having this fortunate perception. We say the person is in the right place at the right time. So the person being in that place at that time to have that experience touches along the lines of synchronicity. But then there's another term, as I'm actually writing up collections of stories of what I call my goofy synchronicity stories. And as I looked at my collection of stories, there was a combination that was not adequately addressed by synchronicity and serendipity. I then coined the phrase or the term sequencity. And I basically, it's two events that rather than happening at the same time, they're more sequential than synchronous. And so I describe it as two or more meaningful events that are not causally related that occur in a comparatively short period of time. So basically, it's just a tweak on the definition that I used for synchronicity. The time element, it can be a few minutes, it can be a few hours, it might even be a few days or a week or more, depending on the significance, depending on the meaning, depending on how unlikely those events are. But they still have significant meaning to the person experiencing them. And I just figured, hey, if Carl Jung can make up new words such as synchronicity, then maybe I get to as well. But it covers a combination of events or variables that sequencity and serendipity didn't adequately cover, at least for some of the experiences that I have. So one of the examples was back a couple of years ago, a few days before my birthday. I'd looked up the book, The Polyvagal Theory by American psychiatrist Stephen Porges. I'd been studying the nervous system a little bit and learning about some of the different states that the nervous system can end up in. And this concept of polyvagal theory kept coming up. So I looked it up, it had a price tag, a new book costs over $40. And I thought, well, I'll think about it. It's not a burning desire to own this. So a few days later, as it turned out, on my birthday, I had gone into a thrift store, browsed around, didn't really find anything, but right at the exit, right as I was leaving, there was several bookcases, and lying horizontally just below eye level was the polyvagal theory. And so along the binder in all capitals, it says the polyvagal theory. And I glanced over, for just a few dollars, I was able to get this book. Sorry, Porges. Sorry to Dr. Porges that I didn't buy it at full price, but it was just this thing that came into my presence just a few days after I'd been looking into it. Now, does that happen all the time? No, but it does happen fairly frequently for me. So all of these types of events, whether it's synchronicity, serendipity, or sequencity, one of the concepts involved is meaning. And so that's one of the more abstract things, because what's meaningful to me may not be meaningful to you or other people. And so it makes it difficult to determine, is that synchronous? I think that's why synchronicity, it can be dismissed easily. Oh, that's just a thing. Oh, that's just coincidence. That's random. I always love it when people talk about random, because again, I'm a statistician. And when you talk about randomness, basically what that is variability, to a statistician anyway, that is variability that we can't yet explain. We don't understand it. And so we kind of throw it off over into this random error or random variability component when we do statistical analyses. So just because someone doesn't see the importance or the impact of these types of events doesn't mean that they're not meaningful to the person who's experiencing them. Oops. And along those lines, there's other considerations and variables to consider, so that even if something is meaningful, that can still vary with regard to the impact that it has to a person. It might be light, might be, that's kind of cool, that's kind of neat. Or it can involve something that's very special and very precious to a person, something that has very deep meaning, maybe a family member, maybe a favorite, a song that is associated to someone that you really care about, or to a certain event that plays at a time when something else happens. So how meaningful something is can vary. Also, how improbable the events are can vary. So the degree of improbability also can make things more noteworthy, more improbable, more unlikely, which is something to consider. Then also for an individual person, the frequency that these types of events happen, that also varies. You know, that on average, maybe each of us has this type of event twice a month, but some people have them twice a week, or, you know, that type of thing. So the frequency that these types of connections can also vary from person to person. One thing I haven't mentioned is that the events can include different senses. For me, a lot of it is audio and visual, but it can sometimes include intuition. It can include smelling something. You smell something that reminds you of someone, and then you see their favorite book or something like that. And again, it's often not perceived by others to be nearly as significant as it is to the person involved. So for me, synchronicity actually, like I say, I get it a lot. I've kept synchronicity, I call them synchronicity journals. I should call them synchronicity, serendipity, and sequencity journals. I've kept them for over 20 years, mainly since the breakdown that I had back in 1998. Just to think of these connections. There's certain songs that make me think of my friend Karen, my friend Nikos, whose souls I felt during the most difficult times. So am I more sensitive to those types of events? Anymore, probably yes. Because, in the last few years, about 6-7 years ago, I did have another awakening. And this time I tried to keep more in contact with some of that underlying tapestry of intersection and connection. So a few years ago, I even coined the phrase, Penny, I can coin things if I want. A synchronicity a day makes for a really weird life. Now, I don't necessarily get them every day, but I do get several a week that I notice. There are some weeks where my journal is just black with notes. There are times where I'll go through a period of 3 or 4 hours driving, between different stores as I'm running errands, or, going to the park and then going over here and doing something else. And it'll just be one thing after another, connection. One thing that I enjoy is that my passion, passion would be the best word, growing up was synchronized swimming. I even competed nationally for 4 years as a teenager. It's what drew me out to the Seattle area. I actually swam as an adult with a master's swimming program, coached for a number of years. And so this whole concept, now it's called artistic swimming, at least I believe at an international level. To me, it will always be synchronized swimming. But this connection between my passion growing up and even swimming related to belly flopping and to mysticism, there's those kinds of connections and those kinds of threads that aren't necessarily synchronous, but I love those kinds of connections as well. And when I was in that non-ordinary state of mystical consciousness during that breakdown in 98, and even in those few years, but especially in 98, when I had to learn how to float, how to tread water, I kind of had to teach myself how to do that in a lot of ways. There are a few things that helped me through, and that'll be the topic of something in the future. But synchronicity, noticing these connections, gave me that sense of, hey, this is a higher purpose. Something is helping me along. It's revealing elements to me in these creative, non-ordinary ways. So being in a non-ordinary state of consciousness and having these kind of non-ordinary, very meaningful experiences was part of that flow and part of that current that I ended up, that actually helped quite a bit. So there's a couple additional quotes here that I came across. I'll just go ahead and read them. And these are Carl Jung quotes. The problem of synchronicity has puzzled me for a long time, ever since the middle 20s, the 1920s. So, and I had heard that before, that he had come up with this concept, and then over a few decades actually captured more events of it or more examples of it. So it puzzled him for a long time, since the middle 20s, when I was investigating the phenomena of the collective unconscious and kept on coming across connections which I simply could not explain as chance groupings or runs. What I found were coincidences, in quotes, which were connected so meaningfully that their chance concurrence would represent a degree of improbability that would have to be expressed by an astronomical figure. That is, the chance of that happening was so ridiculously low that it was noteworthy just in that element by itself. Another one, synchronicity is no more baffling or mysterious than the discontinuities of physics. It is only the ingrained belief in the sovereign power of causality that creates intellectual difficulties and makes it appear unthinkable that causeless events exist or could ever exist. So these causeless events, I don't know if I think things do have a cause, but there's still that independence between them and how that comes together and how that connects in interesting ways. And then a quote that synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. And again, that goes to some people are more receptive, perceptive, recognize the meaning, are impacted. And so those are the folks who it's an ever-present reality for. As I mentioned, not everyone acknowledges these types of connections, usually because they don't experience the impact of the meaning involved. At least that's part of my take as to why not. Some people seem to be more prone to such experiences. I believe I tend to be in the high end. When I end up chatting with friends, we end up just laughing at some of the goofiness. And I often use the phrase, that's how my world works. But it's that concept of meaning is what makes synchronicity kind of difficult to measure. It's not as scientific in that sense. It's not subject to experimental design in that sense. It's more of an observational study, which is also a statistical concept. The meaning is abstract and very personal to each person involved. And so there's, again, a lot of variability, just like there is with these different non-ordinary states that people can experience. And of course, variability of statistics, which is what I kind of bring into some of these topics in these discussions. Okay. So back in, I want to just share one or two of my goofy stories. Last April, 2022, I live north of Yellowstone National Park. And in April, up until about the third weekend, most of the roads, the interior roads, are not open except the North Road. So I'd gone into Yellowstone, was driving along, and I actually felt a twinge of sadness and grief. And at one point I realized, oh, that's because the last time I'd been over this road with my mom, it was on that road. She passed, I like the Native American phrase, she walked on in September of 2019. And the last time we had driven through the park together, we ended up coming over that North Road. We were going in the other direction. I have an older car that just a few months earlier, it's a CD player. Yes, I'm a Luddite. But the CD player stopped working. And so there's parts of Montana, a significant part of Yellowstone, that you cannot get radio reception in, or at least not very well. And this was part of the part of the area where I was not getting much radio reception. And so I turned off the radio. I was reflecting on, how lucky I've been to be able to travel with my parents as I did before they both walked on. And even just some of my goofy experiences, these non-ordinary states, the fact that I've been able to get through them and learn so much from them. It actually, just driving through this beautiful nature, actually brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't crying, but I was just kind of moved by driving through the park, enjoying the scenery, just having, and you can see on the picture on the left that I kind of had the road to myself, which was very enjoyable. And as I crested a hill, I naturally try and turn the radio stations if nothing's playing. And of course, the radio was off. So I turned on the radio. I was cresting a hill, and I caught the song coming out of Big Sky to the west, and it was the song Sweet Emotion. And so I had no idea that song was playing, and here I was feeling Sweet Emotion. And I happened to turn on the radio and caught it fairly decently as I drove because of the elevation where I was driving. So just threw in the pictures of the bison, see a lot of those. And then on the way back, I was coming up through Gardner, Montana, which is on the northern boundary of Yellowstone National Park. As I was driving through town, I noticed a sign that said rummage sale outside of one of the churches. And I had never been in that church, but again, it reminded me of my mom because she used to work the rummage sales at her church. And sometimes I'd help her, and it just brought back some younger memories of, even when I was a little girl in Minnesota, and I enjoyed playing at the rummage sale. So I thought, hey, let's go in and check that out. We'll see what is going on. So I walk in. They had it in the sanctuary of the church. I walk in, and there were some dishes and some cups and some household items. As I looked through the mugs, there was a coffee mug that said Freudian Sips on it, which made me chuckle because as I was writing up these stories, I call them Freudian typos, where I'll mistype something. It actually has a deeper, significant meaning, or just adds a lot of humor. So like one time I was typing up a story about one of my brothers. One brother passed in 1999. My other two brothers are still on this side. And I was typing up a story about my brother Jeff, who had died. And I said something about I was meaning to type for my brother, and I typed for my bother. And so this idea that my brother is a bother is an example of what I call a Freudian typo. So I see this mug that says Freudian Sips, and I thought, oh, hey, that might come in handy as I'm typing up some of these stories. Well, Freud and Jung actually had a close working relationship for a few years back in the early days. Freud, I think, was about 20, 25 years older, but a very close working relationship before there was a serious rift in their beliefs and what they were pursuing, and then they diverged. So I saw this thing that had Freud on it. I thought, I wonder where Carl is. I wonder if I'll find something about Carl. And sure enough, looking through the books, I come across this Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I thought, 25 cents. I think the books were only 25 cents. May as well go ahead and buy it. So I pull it out. But now if you notice, there's a book here, this orange book, that was only about 5 or 6 books away with the author's name of Penelope Lively, whom I'd never heard of. But I did appreciate the name Penelope. Now, my name is not Penelope, it's Penny, but Penny is derived from the name Penelope. So there's kind of my connection. And actually, even just as I was pulling up this picture, I noticed the Bridge of Sighs, which I often sigh and wince when I come across some really good connections. So I pulled out the Penelope Lively book, and I'd noticed the title said Dancing Fish and Ammonites. Now, the concept of dancing fish did make me smile because fish being in the water, dancing ties with synchronized swimming, ties with synchronicity in that sharing of the word. So it is just a connection that did make me smile. And later I was looking through the DVDs and happened to notice there's a rather large box. And there's something about my eye direction that there's a lot of times where my eye will go right to something that has meaning for the context. And I did go straight to the Serendipity after I'd looked at a few other items outside, before I got to the DVD. So it's just kind of a nice way to tie it all together. I would consider that more synchronous, but overall the experience was also serendipitous. So given that, this is just a discussion around it. And the reason I wanted to share this is because as I continue adding content, I'll be using the phrase synchronicity, serendipity, sequencity, especially. And since I made up that word, you're probably not going to know what that is without. And so this is just a reference for people to use. I hope there's something of interest. I thank you for taking a look at this material, and have a great rest of your day.